47 shots. 47 misses. Are you even trying, Pops? Gunnery Sergeant Ryan Miller's voice cut through the hot desert air, sharp and dripping with impatience, carrying over the chaos of snipers squinting at distant steel targets at 1,700 yards. 12 Marines stood tense behind their rifles, sweating under the sun, scopes adjusted, ballistic computers running, but the flags on the range told a cruel story. Nothing hit. Walter Hayes, 82 years old, stood at the edge of the firing line, hands tucked into the pockets of a worn khaki jacket, his weathered face calm, eyes pale blue and steady, absorbing each missed shot without flinching. The sun glared off the metal targets, heat haze wiggling over the sand. But Walter's gaze was fixed on the shifting winds above the range, on the subtle ripple in the grass, on the faint shimmer of the mirage at the far end, as if reading a secret code only he could see. Miller stomped a boot on the gravel, frustration coiling tight and dangerous, and waved a hand at the old man. "Sir, this is a restricted training zone. You should step aside," he sneered, daring Walter to answer. Walter shifted his weight slightly, the leather of his worn M40 rifle bag rubbing against his leg, and in a voice low, growly, and controlled, said, "I'm here to watch." A younger Marine, Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks, glanced at him, then back at the targets, eyebrows furrowed. The tension was thick enough to taste, like static in the air before a storm. Every sniper on the line was a skilled marksman, proud, confident in their calculators and devices, but Walter's presence alone caused a ripple, a subtle doubt, that they couldn't yet name. Miller's lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't a show, old man. You think you can do better?" Walter's eyes twitched just slightly, the hint of a smile hidden beneath years of discipline and quiet observation. "I know I can," he said, almost a whisper, yet the words seemed to hang, impossible to ignore. The Marines exchanged glances, unsure if the old man was joking or serious, while the wind whispered across the range, carrying dust and the faint metallic tang from the steel targets. Walter bent slightly, feeling the weight of the M40 bag, noting the familiar gouge on its walnut stock, worn smooth by decades of use, a scar from a long-ago mission. The heat of the day pressed down, the rotors of a distant helicopter vibrating faintly in the background, but he remained perfectly still, a quiet anchor in the chaos. Miller muttered under his breath, incredulous. What is he even doing here? Walter's gaze scanned the shooters, noting the subtle tension in their shoulders, the micro-adjustments in their stance, the betrayals of confidence that no machine could detect. He exhaled, calm, deliberate, and stepped slightly closer to the line, the gravel crunching under his worn boots, drawing eyes from every Marine, every scope lifting to track him for a fleeting moment. Sensing the gravity in the silence he carried, knowing that soon, everything would change, that the old lessons would return, that the impossible shot was waiting for the right hands to make it real, and the wind, the mirage, the steel targets, all the elements were already aligning in his mind, waiting only for him to act. Walter Hayes remained at the edge of the range, his hands folded behind his back, observing the Marines like a calm tide watching waves crash futilely against the shore. The sun beat down relentlessly, glinting off their scopes and reflecting on polished lenses. Yet Walter's pale blue eyes tracked the subtle shifts of wind and heat over the distant targets, reading each invisible ripple as if it were written plainly in the air. Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks shifted uneasily, noticing the serene stillness of the old man juxtaposed against the frantic adjustments of his peers, his fingers twitching on the rifle trigger, muscles tense with anticipation and a growing, unnamed doubt. The younger Marines whispered to one another, the words catching on the dry air, sharing looks of incredulity, unable to reconcile the presence of a man who appeared so ordinary with the weight of his quiet confidence. Gunnery Sergeant Miller's frustration deepened, his shadow cutting across the sand as he stepped closer to Walter, his voice sharp and unwavering. "Sir, this is a training exercise. I need you to move aside." Walter tilted his head slightly, a faint smile curling the corners of his mouth, the years etched on his face not diminishing the commanding presence he exuded, and he replied softly, deliberately, "I am observing." The words, simple yet absolute, seemed to ripple outward, drawing the eyes of every sniper along the line, catching attention not by volume, but by the unshakable certainty behind them. Ethan felt a chill of recognition, sensing that this was no ordinary observer, that Walter's eyes held decades of knowledge and experience, a mastery of marksmanship that no machine, no computer could replicate. The air grew taut with anticipation, the metallic scent of targets mingling with the heat rising from the sand, and a distant helicopter whirred faintly in the background, a low, persistent vibration underfoot. Walter shifted his weight slightly, reaching down to adjust the strap on his worn M40 rifle bag, revealing just enough of the stock to show the familiar gouge, smooth from countless years of service, a mark that hinted at a history beyond immediate comprehension. Miller's jaw tightened, skepticism and impatience warring within him, yet he could not tear his eyes away from the figure who moved so deliberately, so unaffected, in the midst of the chaos. A bead of sweat ran down Ethan's temple as he realized that the ordinary metrics of performance, the ballistic computers, the spotters, the digital readings, were irrelevant here. Walter's attention was on the intangible elements, the dance of wind currents across the range, the subtle heat shimmer on the steel targets, the quiet whispers of experience that no manual could teach. He took a measured step closer, gravel crunching softly beneath his boots, and the world seemed to pause, every Marine subconsciously sensing the shift, the latent power of knowledge honed over decades, waiting, patient, ready to transform the impossible into reality. The tension built, a taut string stretched across the firing line, and for the first time, a quiet murmur rippled through the ranks of snipers, a shared, unspoken acknowledgement that the man standing before them was not merely an observer, but a keeper of truths they were only beginning to perceive. The sun climbed higher, the heat rising from the sand in wavering waves that danced over the steel targets, and Walter Hayes remained unmoved, a solitary figure at the edge of the firing line, observing the flurry of activity with an uncanny stillness. Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks could not tear his eyes away from him, the quiet aura of mastery radiating from Walter's stance cutting through the noise and tension like a blade through fog. The younger Marines adjusted scopes and recalculated trajectories, checking ballistic tables, cross-referencing wind data, yet their movements betrayed growing unease as they sensed the gravity of Walter's presence without understanding why. Gunnery Sergeant Miller's voice sliced through the air again, louder, more impatient. "Move aside, sir. You are not part of this exercise." Walter tilted his head, a faint smile hidden under years of discipline, and simply replied, "I am watching." His eyes swept over the flags fluttering in the distance, the subtle shimmer of heat mirage, the dust curling around spent shells, reading a pattern invisible to anyone else. Ethan noticed the small, deliberate movements of Walter's hands, the way he rested lightly on the M40 rifle bag, feeling the familiar gouge in the stock, a mark of history, a silent signal of expertise unspoken yet deeply understood. Other Marines began to exchange glances, whispers cutting through the hot air, their confidence slowly eroding under the weight of Walter's quiet assessment. Miller's jaw tightened, irritation and disbelief warring within him, and he stepped closer, the gravel crunching under his boots, eyes narrowing at the elderly figure who defied all expectation. "Do you even know what you are doing here?" Miller demanded, the words sharp, meant to provoke, to dismiss. Walter's pale blue eyes met his without aggression, without challenge, but with an authority that needed no amplification, and he said, "I am here to see it done correctly." The statement, calm and precise, created a ripple across the firing line, subtle yet undeniable. Ethan could feel a tightening in his chest, a quiet recognition stirring as he watched the old Marine's gaze trace the invisible lines between the firing point and the distant targets, reading wind, light, and angle in a way no instrument could replicate. The air seemed to hold its breath, the distant hum of a helicopter blending with the whisper of the breeze across the range, every Marine subconsciously acknowledging the shift in focus, the emergence of something far older, far wiser, and far more skilled than the technology and training before them. Walter bent slightly, adjusting the strap on the rifle bag, exposing just enough of the stock to reveal the gouge, the smooth patina earned over decades, a single scar that hinted at a life spent mastering precision. Every micro-movement, every subtle gesture, conveyed a depth of knowledge and patience that no hurried calculation could achieve. The young snipers felt a strange tension, a mixture of anticipation and humility, sensing that the next moment would challenge every expectation they had, that the ordinary rules of the range no longer applied, and that the old man, standing quietly, hands at his sides, would soon turn their understanding of skill, experience, and focus upside down. Walter inhaled slowly, scanning the line one final time, his gaze settling on each Marine, reading intent, posture, and doubt, preparing for the invisible countdown that would precede the demonstration of mastery, a silent prelude to the moment when the impossible would become visible, and every element on the range, the wind, the heat, the targets, the observers, would bend to the certainty and precision held within his calm, experienced hands. Gunnery Sergeant Miller finally let out a sharp laugh, the kind born from frustration more than amusement, and pointed toward the worn rifle bag resting against Walter Hayes's leg. "All right," he said loudly enough for everyone on the range to hear. "Let us see what miracle is hiding in there." Several Marines chuckled, grateful for anything that could break the tension that had settled over the firing line. Walter said nothing. He crouched slowly and reached for the zipper. The sound was soft, almost lost beneath the wind moving across the range. Every eye followed his hands. The old rifle emerged inch by inch, revealing walnut wood darkened by age, steel worn smooth from decades of careful handling, and a simple scope that looked ancient beside the advanced optics mounted on the Marines' rifles. The reaction was immediate. A few Marines exchanged amused looks. One shook his head. Another smirked openly. To them, it looked less like a precision instrument and more like something that belonged behind glass in a museum. Miller folded his arms across his chest. "You are kidding." Walter ignored him. He rested the rifle gently across a bench as though placing down something irreplaceable. Ethan Brooks found himself stepping closer. The rifle carried a strange presence. It was old, certainly, but it did not look neglected. Every inch of it appeared maintained with obsessive care. The wood held tiny marks earned through years of use. The metal carried a dull finish polished by thousands of careful touches. Then Miller noticed the gouge. It sat near the rear of the stock, deeper than the other scratches, cutting across the walnut at an angle. "Look at that," Miller said. "You keep telling us this thing is special, but it looks like somebody dropped it down a mountain." Several Marines laughed. Miller reached out and tapped the damaged section with a finger. "What happened there?" "Lose a fight with a toolbox." The instant his finger touched the gouge, Walter's eyes settled on the mark. The laughter around him faded. The hot desert air disappeared. The firing line vanished. For a brief moment, he was somewhere else entirely. Rain dripped from broad jungle leaves. Thick fog clung to the ground. Everything smelled of wet earth and diesel fuel. The air was heavy enough to feel. Young Marines moved quietly through a sea of green. A younger Walter lay prone beneath a canopy of trees, his cheek pressed against this same rifle. The gouge had not existed yet. Somewhere nearby, rotor blades echoed through the mist. A young lieutenant crouched beside him, nervous but determined, watching a distant hillside through binoculars. "You see it?" the lieutenant had whispered. Walter remembered nodding. He remembered studying wind no instrument could measure. He remembered waiting. Not because he was uncertain, but because patience was part of the shot. The memory shifted. The rifle bumped against a jagged piece of metal during a hurried movement. The fresh gouge appeared in the stock. The lieutenant looked over. "That is going to leave a mark." Walter had smiled. "As long as it still works." The memory vanished as quickly as it came. Heat returned. Sunlight replaced jungle shadows. The firing range snapped back into focus. Miller was still standing there, still smirking, unaware that the scar he mocked carried half a century of history. Walter gently ran a thumb across the gouge and looked toward the distant target. His expression never changed. But Ethan noticed something different. The old Marine's eyes had become heavier somehow, as if an invisible door had opened for only a second. And for the first time all afternoon, Ethan was absolutely certain of one thing. Walter Hayes was not here by accident. Walter Hayes straightened, the aged M40 resting in his hands with a careful familiarity that spoke louder than any word could. The desert air shimmered above the range. carrying dust and faint scents of the hot sand, and every Marine shifted slightly, some gripping their rifles tighter, some leaning forward, curiosity and apprehension dancing in their eyes. Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks felt a tightening in his chest, a pulse of anticipation that was nearly tangible, the kind of tension that heralds something rare and unforgettable. Walter's gaze swept the line, slow and deliberate, noting stance, posture, and subtle twitches in muscle that spoke of readiness and overconfidence. He did not rush. The rifles of the young Marines, gleaming and complex, sat in sharp contrast to his worn, simple M40. Yet there was an authority in the weight and balance of the old rifle that seemed to anchor the space around him. Miller cleared his throat, muttering under his breath, a mix of skepticism and disbelief. Walter ignored it entirely, eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned the heat shimmer of the distant steel targets, reading currents of wind and distortion across the sand as if they were words written plainly in the air. The younger Marines murmured among themselves, whispering half-heard questions, glancing at one another with uncertainty creeping into their confidence. Walter adjusted his stance, feet planted with a quiet stability born of decades of practice, his hands settling over the rifle with careful precision, feeling the familiar grooves, the worn stock, the subtle scar of the gouge. The desert seemed to pause around him. The hum of a distant helicopter faded into background noise, the crunch of gravel beneath boots softened by an almost meditative silence. He lifted the rifle slowly, aligning the sights with the distant target, and every eye along the line followed, some incredulous, some unconsciously holding their breath. Ethan noticed the faint tremor of anticipation in the younger Marines, the subtle narrowing of eyes, the shift in posture, all unnoticed by Walter, who seemed completely immersed in the task at hand. The old Marine breathed deeply, inhaling the hot, dry air, letting the subtle movements of heat and dust guide his focus. He exhaled, smooth and controlled, his gaze never wavering, never hurried, a calm rhythm that contrasted with the impatience around him. The weight of expectation pressed down like invisible heat, and yet Walter seemed untouched, as if operating in a plane beyond the anxious calculations of the young snipers. He adjusted the angle slightly, feeling the wind against his cheek, tracking the faint ripple of dust over the sand, measuring the invisible curves between the firing point and the target. Ethan felt a thrill of recognition. The old Marine was no longer simply watching, he was reading the environment with an intimate understanding born of decades of experience. Walter steadied the rifle, his hands firm, eyes scanning, mind mapping invisible currents, and for the first time, the young Marine sensed that this was no ordinary marksmanship display. The line seemed to lean forward collectively, the air thick with expectation, every detail of wind, mirage, and target distilled into a single moment poised on the edge of realization. Walter's presence alone commanded attention, drawing out a silence that contrasted sharply with the restless energy of the range, an unspoken signal that what was about to happen would rewrite their understanding of skill and mastery. The sun glinted off the targets one last time before a hush fell across the firing line. A collective breath held in anticipation of the inevitable demonstration of decades-honed expertise waiting within the old Marine's calm, steady hands. Ethan Brooks could no longer focus on the target. While the other Marines remained locked on Walter Hayes and the old rifle resting in his hands, Ethan found himself staring at the gouge in the walnut stock. Something about it refused to leave his mind. He had seen that rifle before. Not the rifle itself, but photographs, stories, fragments of conversations whispered by older armorers late at night when training was over and the range had gone quiet. The memory sat just beyond reach. Walter remained calm, studying the distant landscape while the wind shifted across the valley. Around him, the Marines waited, their skepticism slowly transforming into curiosity. Gunnery Sergeant Miller folded his arms tighter, trying to project confidence, but even he seemed uncertain now. Ethan took a slow step backward and glanced toward the small equipment shed near the edge of the range. His heart beat faster. He remembered a dusty display case inside the armory headquarters. He remembered an old photograph showing a young Marine standing beside a group of instructors. The image had been faded, almost forgotten. But one detail remained clear. A rifle with a distinctive gouge in the stock. Ethan swallowed hard. No, it could not be. He slipped his phone from his pocket and moved away from the firing line. The desert heat pressed against him as he walked toward a maintenance vehicle parked near the fence. He checked over his shoulder. Nobody was paying attention. Every eye remained fixed on Walter. Ethan opened his contacts and called Sergeant First Class Daniel Mercer, an armory supervisor he trusted. The phone rang twice. Mercer. Ethan lowered his voice. Sergeant, I need a favor. You are interrupting range hours. This better be important. Ethan glanced toward Walter. Do we have any records connected to a Marine sniper called Ghost 7? Silence answered him. Not static. Not confusion. Silence. Then Mercer spoke again, slower this time. Where did you hear that name? Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. I have not. Not exactly. I just need to know if it means something. Another pause. Papers shuffled in the background. A chair moved. Then Mercer's voice dropped. Who are you standing next to right now? Ethan looked toward the firing line. Walter Hayes stood motionless beneath the blazing sun, his eyes tracking the invisible movement of the wind. An old Marine named Walter Hayes. The reaction on the other end was immediate. Ethan heard something hit the floor. Do not let him leave. What? Listen carefully. Do not let him leave. Ethan's pulse quickened. Who is he? Mercer did not answer directly. Instead, he said, Stay where you are. The call ended. Ethan stared at the screen. Less than 30 seconds later, his phone vibrated again. An incoming number from base headquarters. Then another. Then another. Around the range, nothing had changed. The Marines still waited. Walter still watched the horizon. Gunnery Sergeant Miller still believed he was in control. But far beyond the firing line, inside offices and command buildings Ethan would never normally enter, a name that had not been spoken in years was suddenly moving through channels with astonishing speed. And every person who heard it seemed to react exactly the same way. The first call reached the armory. The second reached battalion operations. The third reached a secure office 3 buildings away from headquarters. By the fourth call, nobody was asking whether the information was correct. They were asking whether Walter Hayes was still there. Ethan Brooks stared at his phone as another incoming call appeared. This one carried a command prefix he had never seen before. He answered immediately. Lance Corporal Brooks. Confirm the individual remains on the range. The voice was calm, professional, and carried the unmistakable weight of authority. Yes, sir. Has he departed? No, sir. Good. Keep him there. The line disconnected. Ethan lowered the phone slowly. His pulse hammered in his ears. Around him, nothing appeared different. The range remained wrapped in shimmering heat. The distant steel targets stood motionless beneath the afternoon sun. Marines shifted their boots across the gravel. Someone laughed nervously. Someone adjusted a spotting scope. Yet Ethan suddenly felt as though he were standing in the center of something much larger than a training exercise. 50 yards away, Walter Hayes remained completely unaware of the storm moving through command channels. Or perhaps he was aware. Ethan could not tell. The old Marine stood with the same relaxed posture he had carried all afternoon, studying the horizon as if time itself moved more slowly around him. Gunnery Sergeant Miller glanced toward Ethan. Everything all right? Ethan hesitated. Yes, Gunny. It was not a lie. It was simply nowhere close to the truth. Across the state, inside a conference room at division headquarters, a colonel stared at a personnel file that had not been opened in nearly 20 years. The photograph attached to it showed a younger Walter Hayes standing beside several Marine instructors. One of them wore lieutenant bars. Colonel James Porter looked at the image twice before reaching for the phone. Get me General Kane. The response came immediately. The general is in a briefing. Not anymore. Back at the range, the atmosphere continued to shift. The younger Marines had stopped joking. They had stopped smirking. Curiosity had replaced amusement. Walter rested the M40 against the bench and looked toward the valley below the target area. The breeze changed direction. Barely. Just enough to bend a patch of dry grass. Walter noticed instantly. Ethan noticed Walter noticing. That alone felt important. A low rumble drifted across the desert. At first, nobody paid attention. Military aircraft crossed the skies regularly. But the sound grew stronger. Deeper. Closer. Several Marines glanced upward. Miller followed their gaze. Far beyond the ridgeline, a helicopter appeared. Then another. The aircraft moved steadily toward the installation. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Another vibration hit his phone. A message appeared from Sergeant Mercer. For words, "Do not let him leave." Ethan read the message twice, then a third time. When he looked up, Walter was still watching the horizon. Calm, patient, almost as if he had seen this exact sequence unfold before. The helicopters continued closing the distance, sunlight flashing across their windshields. Nobody on the firing line understood why command channels were suddenly erupting. Nobody except Ethan knew how many calls had already been made. And nobody yet realized that while they were waiting for an old Marine to prove himself, someone very important was racing across the desert to reach him before the demonstration even began. The helicopters were close enough now that every Marine on the range could hear them. Heads turned toward the horizon. Conversations stopped. Even Gunnery Sergeant Miller glanced upward before forcing his attention back to the firing line. Whatever was happening elsewhere on the base could wait. Right now he intended to settle the question standing in front of him. He looked at Walter Hayes and gestured toward the shooting position. "All right, sir. Show us." The challenge hung in the hot afternoon air. Walter simply nodded. No speech. No lecture. No attempt to prove a point. He carried the M40 to the firing point and lowered himself behind it with deliberate care. The movement was smooth despite his age, practiced so many times that it appeared almost effortless. The younger Marines watched closely. Several expected him to ask for wind data. Others assumed he would want a spotter. Some believed he would ask for range calculations. Walter asked for none of it. He rested behind the rifle and looked through the scope. Silence settled across the range. The distant steel target shimmered through layers of heat rising from the valley floor. A strong crosswind pushed through one section of terrain. A weaker current moved through another. The electronic weather station displayed numbers. Walter never looked at it. Instead, his eyes drifted briefly to a patch of dry grass, then to a cluster of rocks halfway downrange, then to the faint movement of dust near the target itself. Ethan Brooks watched in amazement. Walter was reading the entire landscape. Not a single point. Not a single number. The entire environment. Miller folded his arms and waited. Minutes seemed to stretch. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sounds came from the wind and the distant approach of the helicopters. Walter adjusted the rifle slightly. Less than an inch. Then another fraction. Tiny corrections invisible to most observers. His breathing remained slow and steady. Calm. Controlled. Certain. Ethan suddenly realized something. Walter was not calculating. He already knew. Everything about his posture suggested familiarity rather than effort. As if he had stood before challenges like this countless times before. The old Marine settled completely. The rifle became motionless. The range seemed to hold its breath with him. Then came the moment. Simple. Quiet. Almost ordinary. Walter squeezed the trigger. A heartbeat passed. Then another. Every eye locked onto the distant target. For an instant nothing happened. Then a sharp metallic ring echoed across the valley. Clear. Unmistakable. The steel target swayed gently beneath the afternoon sun. Nobody reacted at first. The sound itself seemed impossible. Several Marines stared through their optics in disbelief. One lowered his spotting scope and checked again. Another looked toward the weather station as though expecting an explanation. None came. Ethan felt goosebumps rise along his arms. Gunnery Sergeant Miller stood frozen. The confidence that had carried him all afternoon vanished from his face. Walter calmly lifted his head from the stock and looked toward the target one final time. There was no celebration, no smile, no triumph, just quiet confirmation, as if the result had never been in doubt. Above the range, the helicopters continued descending, growing larger with every passing second. And for the first time all afternoon, the impossible shot was no longer the biggest story unfolding on that firing line. The metallic echo from the distant target had barely faded when the helicopters crossed directly over the range. Rotor wash swept across the desert floor, sending dust and loose gravel skittering across the firing line. Every Marine turned. Every conversation stopped. The aircraft descended toward a landing area beyond the range fence, and within moments the engines began winding down. An uneasy silence settled over the entire facility. Walter Hayes remained seated behind the M40, calm, unmoved, as if helicopters arriving unexpectedly after an impossible shot was nothing unusual at all. Ethan Brooks watched in disbelief as several vehicles appeared from the access road. moving far faster than regulations normally allowed. Doors opened before the vehicles had fully stopped. Senior officers stepped out. Then more officers. The sight alone was enough to make several Marines straighten instinctively. Gunnery Sergeant Miller stared, confused. None of this made sense. A colonel crossed the range at a brisk pace, ignoring everyone else. His eyes locked onto Walter. Behind him came another officer. Then another. The atmosphere changed completely. What had begun as a training day now felt like something historic unfolding in real time. Walter slowly stood and lifted the old rifle from the bench. The sunlight caught the worn walnut stock. The same gouge. The same scar. The same rifle that had quietly carried decades of memories. Then the final vehicle arrived. The door opened. A tall man stepped out wearing the stars of a general. Every Marine immediately recognized him. General Robert Kane. Conversations vanished. Movement stopped. The range fell silent. Kane walked forward without hesitation. He did not look at the targets. He did not look at the instructors. He did not look at the officers waiting nearby. His entire focus remained on Walter Hayes. Ethan noticed something remarkable. The closer the general came, the more emotional his expression became. Not excitement. Not authority. Respect. Genuine respect. Walter met his gaze and offered a small nod. Nothing more. General Kane stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither man spoke. Decades seemed to pass between them in that silence. Then, in front of every Marine on the range, General Kane raised his hand and rendered a perfect salute. A collective breath caught across the firing line. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Walter returned the salute with the same quiet dignity he had carried all afternoon. Kane lowered his hand and smiled. "Good to see you again, Ghost 7. The words landed like thunder. Ethan felt his heart pound. Miller stared as if the world had tilted beneath his feet. Kane turned toward the assembled Marines. "Everything you train with today," he said, his voice carrying across the range. "Every lesson, every doctrine, every long-range standard you study, traces back to the man standing here." The general looked back at Walter. "Most of you know the system. Very few know who built it." No one laughed now. No one doubted. The old Marine they had dismissed hours earlier stood quietly beneath the desert sun, needing no explanation and no recognition. His skill had already spoken for him. Around the range, Marines stood a little straighter, eyes filled with a new understanding. Walter glanced once more toward the distant target, then toward the horizon where the wind still moved across the valley exactly as it always had. Some things changed with time. Technology changed. Procedures changed. Generations changed. But mastery remained. And as the afternoon light settled across the range, every person present learned the same lesson. Respect is not demanded. It is earned, carried quietly, and remembered long after the world forgets the name attached to it.